Hi, this is Jason with Forney Industries. I'm going to talk to you about the Forney Easy Weld 140 FCI. The FCI stands for flux-core inverter. This machine is a really nice, clean running machine. One of the things I love about the FCI is that I have infinite voltage and infinite wire feed speed controls here. Not all entry-level flux-core machines have infinite controls, so that's one of the things I love about this machine. Let's talk about the typical applications for this machine. Normally, whoever is going to buy this is going to be kind of a first-time welder. That might be like a do-it-yourselfer working on their farm, their ranch, their automobile restoration project. Maybe they have a lawnmower they need to fix or a trailer that needs some repair. That's the typical application for this machine. This machine is really only good up to about 1/4 inch of steel. This machine would not be good for aluminum or stainless steel, but it's good for up to 1/4 inch steel down to sheet metal. When we talk about the power for this machine, the input power, you'll notice that I have a 120 volt plug here or a power cord. I want to plug this into my outlet back here. You'll notice that this outlet happens to be a 20 amp outlet. We strongly recommend a 20 amp outlet with a 20 amp breaker. If you can and your electrical codes allow it, we also recommend upgrading to a 25 amp breaker, so that way you're not tripping your breaker and having to go reset it and so forth. So when I say 120 volt power, that's the input power. This machine operates just fine anywhere from 110 volts up to 120 volts, and there's a nice range there. So the voltage input usually isn't a problem. What most customers get frustrated with is that they tend to have shop lights and other things hooked into their power circuit, so then they start tripping their breakers. So it's really important that you don't have anything else plugged into your 120 volt outlet that you're using with this machine. It needs all the power input that it can get so it can produce the maximum power output. This machine is listed at 90 amps at 30% duty cycle. The reality is it will actually produce more than 90 amps output, and the real world duty cycle is above 30%. The 30% is really measured around 110 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't know how many people weld at 110 degrees Fahrenheit, but it's a little bit unusual. Let's say your typical application is welding in your shop and it's anywhere from 50 to 80 degrees in your shop. Normally you're going to get about 5 to 8 minutes of uninterrupted welding with this machine. So that's plenty for your typical DIY. One note I want to make you aware of is that we recommend 030 flux-core wire. The flux-core wire should be self-shielded. So you don't need any gas with this machine. You'll notice that there is no place to actually plug in gas. Some people refer to this as a MIG welder, but the more proper terminology is a wire feed welder because there is no gas used with this welder. Okay, so we recommend 030 wire. Well, why is it? I want to use 035. The main difference is the sweet spot. With a 030 wire, you're going to have a very large sweet spot, and you can weld anywhere from fairly thin sheet metal up to 1/4 inch with 030, okay? And it's going to be very easy to dial it in. With an 035 wire, can it be used with this machine? Yes. For one, you're going to draw more amperage, so you're going to tend to pop your circuit breaker more often, which that's kind of frustrating. And your sweet spot goes from nice and wide and easy to dial in to very narrow and difficult to dial in. So we always recommend an 030 flux-core wire with this machine. So let's look a little bit on how we load the wire and adjust the tension and so forth. So when we're talking about operating this here, we're going to look at the front panel. You'll notice your left knob here is V for voltage, so I can adjust my voltage. You'll notice this area of darker green here is 5 to 7. Normally when I'm using this machine, my voltage is somewhere between 5 and 8. That's a normal setting, but it depends on the thickness of your material. And my wire feed speed is same. It's usually somewhere between 5 and 8 on my wire feed speed, and you'll notice those areas are darker green. What's interesting as well is that if I have my voltage like this and my wire feed speed like this, it's not going to weld very well because my wire feed speed is all the way turned over to the right where my voltage is on the left. Normally, when you're dialing in this machine, you're going to want both the voltage and the wire feed speed pointed in roughly the same quadrant on your dial here. So if I'm going to increase my wire feed speed, odds are I'm going to also increase my voltage some. So these should be working together. You just don't want to have these in opposite areas over here. Okay, so you'll also notice that we have a over temperature light, a input voltage light, make sure that everything is good. Okay, on the front of the machine we have this ground coming out. It's really important that we have this properly grounded. You'll notice my ground is back here. It's actually attached to clean bare metal. You don't ever want to attach the ground to painted material or coated material or rusty material. You want it nice and clean. The best case scenario is you can actually clamp this to whatever you're going to weld, but in a lot of cases that's not practical. You may want to actually just clamp it to your work table, which is what I like to do back here. Okay, so then obviously the wire can come through my MIG gun, and you'll see my MIG gun, sometimes referred to as a MIG torch, laying on the table right here. So let's talk a little bit about my front end consumables on my MIG torch or MIG gun. You'll notice that this gun right here has a nozzle on it. And a lot of customers go, why did you include a nozzle? There's no gas flowing through this machine. Why would you want to have a nozzle on a flux-core machine? Well, we find that if you're new to welding, sometimes it can be difficult to weld. So usually when you're welding, you're actually dragging the weld along like this, and you can actually use this nozzle here to help keep the proper stick out, and the stick out is the distance between the end of the tip and whatever you're working. So that's why we actually included the nozzle, is to help first-time welders be able to maintain the proper stick out. However, if you weld all the time and you don't need help maintaining a proper stick out, I'd just go ahead and remove that nozzle altogether. There's no reason that you necessarily need this nozzle. Okay, you'll notice here on the end of the torch, I have a diffuser. Normally in a MIG welding machine, you have gas that comes out of this diffuser. Obviously this is a flux-core machine. I don't have gas coming out of here, so it's just solid bronze. Okay, and then you have a copper tip here. When you have a copper tip, you want to match it with the size of the wire. So normally, you're running 030 wire in here. You want an 03 size tip. And then you want to make sure it's nice and snug. If this tip gets loose in here, which happens sometimes when you're welding, this tip will heat up and cool down and get loose in here. You want to take your welpers or your MIG pliers, they're commonly referred to, and you just want to snug up your tip a little bit, make sure it fits in there nice and snug. It shouldn't feel any looseness in any of these front end consumables here. Okay, so I'll go ahead and put this nozzle back on even though you don't necessarily need it. Okay. And you'll notice on your MIG torch is a nice place here. You can actually hang this MIG torch right off your machine like that. A nice little feature of this torch wrap handle. Okay, so let's take a look on the inside of the 140 FCI. Okay, I'm going to rotate this here a little bit so you can see inside. You can lift up the door. If you're not sure what welding parameters you need, we list the welding parameters here based on the thickness of material that you want to weld. It's very easy to follow. You will notice that we do not recommend any parameters for 035. Again, going back to my previous points, 030 wire is recommended, although you can use 035. Okay, so when we're looking inside the cabinet, this cabinet was designed so that you can use a 8-inch spool. That's what you see here right now is an 8-inch spool. Usually on an 8-inch spool you have 10, 11, maybe 12 pounds of wire on an 8-inch spool. I really like the 8-inch spool. It's a little bit cheaper per pound than your smaller 2 inches, and it tends to feed a little bit better than your small 2-pound spools. But if you want to use a 2-pound spool, those are typically referred to as a 4-inch spool. This can easily adapt to a 4-inch spool. All you have to do is remove this and then it'll slide over the spindle here. So when I look at my D-spooler, there's a wing nut here. This wing nut controls the tension spring inside my D-spooler. It's very important that you set your D-spooler tension appropriately so that you don't have too much drag, too much tension on the overall system. So when I'm welding, when I'm done welding, I want the wire coming from my spool to my wire feeder a little bit loose. So when I let off on my trigger, you should be able to touch this, and this should not be real firm. This should be a little bit of looseness to it. That typically says that I have my tension back here set properly. One of the common mistakes is that people will really crank down on this, and then it's just not wanting to feed right. So when you look at this wing nut really should be just slightly protruding past this outer plastic here, and that's a good rule of thumb to set your tension back here on your despooler. So let's talk about setting the tension on your wire feeder. Okay, you can obviously this lift arm here can flip up like that, so you can easily take wire off of your spool. You want to make sure your wire comes off of the bottom of the spool. If your wire is coming off the top, it's going to come down like this, and it's going to be at a really sharp angle, and it's going to want to kink. So you want to make sure your wire comes off the back here and off the bottom of the spool through your inlet guide and go over your drive roll. If you actually look at your drive roll, there's 2 grooves on your drive roll. One's for 030 wire and one's for 035 wire. You want to make sure you have the proper wire groove selected. So one of the ways I can actually do that is I can make sure, like if I have 030 wire in here, which is what I have, it needs to go across the skinnier groove on my wire drive roll here. Okay, if I'm using 035 wire, it needs to go across the slightly larger groove here. If I needed to remove this, I can simply rotate this, take this out, okay, and I can actually flip this drive roll any way I need. So you'll see a little bit larger groove here and a little bit skinnier groove here. The skinnier groove is for 030, the wider groove is for 035. Okay, so I will put that back in like this. Okay, I look at it, I rotate that in. Okay, yep, I see it. It's going across the skinny groove there, which is 030. That's good. Okay. Typically, this is a little bit difficult to put on if you already have wire here, but if you just kind of slide this off to the side, you can get this in there. Okay, there you go. Of course, I messed up my wire a little bit, but that's all right. We'll take care of that in a second. Okay, so then I can drop this back in here. I'm going to pull this back a bit. Okay, make sure my wire's in my groove here. Put my swing arm. So one of the things that is a little bit difficult for some customers is adjusting the tension on your swing arm or your wire drive system. What I always recommend is that you look at this plastic nut here, and there's a bolt here. I want the top of this here flush with that bolt, and that tends to get me about the right tension. One of the things that some customers think is they think more tension is better. I'm telling you, more tension is not better. If you have a round tubular wire, if you put too much tension on it, it's going to squash that wire, and it's not going to feed well at all. So you want just enough tension so as it feeds through the system, you get good welds out of it. So how do you know if the tension is set appropriately? Well, let's go ahead and we're going to plug in this machine. So I'm going to take my power cord, plug it in over here. Okay, back of the machine, I'm going to turn the machine on. You hear the fan kick on. Fan kicks on, that says everything's good. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and remove my nozzle. Okay, so when I pull the trigger, wire should come out. Okay, I got wire coming out. That's a good sign. That means everything is lined up here. The way I test the tension of particularly the wire drive system here is by pinching this with my fingers. Okay, I shouldn't be able to stop that wire very easily. You know, I can, if I pinch it really hard, I can kind of slow it down, but if I just lightly pinch it, it goes right through my fingers. That tells me that it's set right. You can also do this with a pair of gloves. So that's one way you can check the tension, okay? And then I can come over here and go, yeah, okay, that's a little bit loose. So that tells me my despooler tension is set properly as well. I also can feel this wire and make sure that it's not deformed and it's coming out nice and smooth, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and close the door because we have everything set properly on the inside of the cabinet. All right. I'm going to take my welding pliers, I'm going to snip this off. Okay. The stick out that you want, which is the distance between the tip and whatever I'm welding, is typically around 3/8, half of an inch, which is about what you see here. Okay, that's what you want for a stick out. So that's what you see, that's what you're going to cut. A way to see if you have the proper stick out is you can actually take your welding pliers here, and the thickness of the welding pliers is about the stick out that you want. So you can actually line that up and go, oh, yep, you know what? Hey, that's right about 3/8 of an inch. That's a good way to snip it. That kind of tells you when I'm welding what kind of stick out I have. Some customers struggle a little bit because they're used to older flux-core machines. On older flux-core machines, I could take this wire and I could touch it to the workpiece, and all of a sudden it's going to start sparking on me, okay? Even if I don't pull the trigger. That was a ways that some older machines operated, but we think it's safer to have a machine that it does not arc until I pull the trigger. So I have to pull this trigger, which initiates the contactor inside of here, which then allows it to weld. So make sure that you're pulling the trigger, because it's not going to weld if I just attach this wire, or put the wire against the metal like that. So, okay, so that kind of wraps up the basics of the Forney Easy Weld 140 FCI, okay? But let's talk a little bit about some of the other things that you would need to go along with this machine. I obviously recommend a slag hammer to remove the slag, because you're going to have a little bit of a thin slag on your weld. You also need a wire brush. This is good for prepping the material before you weld, and then also cleaning the flux after you weld. You'll probably need a pair of welding pliers, or you can get by with some diagonal cutters. Okay, and then obviously you'll need a welding helmet. I always prefer an auto darkening welding helmet. That way it allows me to see my work and what I'm doing, and then as soon as I strike an arc, the lens is going to go dark and protect my eyes. So definitely recommend an auto darkening helmet. Okay, and then anytime I'm doing welding, you also want a pair of safety glasses. That's very important because you can get sparks and slag that pop up into your eye. And then a nice pair of welding gloves. I prefer a pair of welding gloves that is all leather, but a little bit on the thin side, so I have good dexterity with what I'm working. So, okay, that kind of wraps up the introduction to the Forney Easy Weld 140 FCI. If you have any questions, you can always contact Forney and speak to one of our engineering technicians, and we'd be happy to help you use this machine or help you with any application advice you might have.